Welcome everybody to our From Malabar to Coromandel Deccan Heritage Art and Culture webinar. We are currently in our second season in springtime. And to enter springtime, we have a wonderful lecture today by Dr. Nicolas Roth. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say that this lecture is being recorded and it will be posted on the Center of Islamic Studies YouTube site, as well as the Deccan Heritage Foundation's YouTube site. This lecture series is a very unique collaboration between the Center of Islamic Studies in Cambridge, the Deccan Heritage Foundation, and the Srikantadatta Narasimharaja Wadiyar Foundation in Mysore. So this is a really happy confluence of three different and good organizations. And so if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, but I encourage you to sort of wait until our speaker is done because he may have answered your question during the lecture, and we will try to get to your questions in sort of a thematic order at the end of our lecture today. Today our lecture is entitled Balsam and Betel Nut Palm, Botanical Representation in the Early Modern Deccan. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicolas Roth. Dr. Nicolas Roth received his PhD in South Asian Studies from Harvard University. His research explores the history of gardens, horticulture in early modern India, as well as the material and intellectual culture of the region more broadly. He works with materials in Sanskrit, Persian, and various forms of Hindi and Urdu across a broad array of textual genres, as well as visual sources found in painting and other art forms. Personally, I just like to say that it's very rare to have a scholar who is committed to multilingualism and is also a practicing gardener and is very, very attentive to the visual. So Helen and I thought it would be a great thing to bring him further south in his research. And he kindly agreed to give this lecture today. So with that, I turn over the virtual podium to Nicolas.
All right, let me just see if I can share my slides here. My computer is being attacked. So, all right, so does that look good? Everyone seeing the slides? All right. So before I delve into the talk properly, I just wanted to say a few more words sort of situating where this work is at and where it's coming from after this wonderful introduction from Vivek. So this is somewhat unusual for me, much more heavily based on the image rather than the text. I have been working with visual sources and particularly painting for a while, including for my dissertation research, but it's usually been to sort of situate the text, as being, in an area studies program, having been trained in primarily textual analysis. Whereas this is somewhat new territory for me, not just geographically, because it's focusing on the Deccan, whereas previously, while working with some Deccan materials, I've mainly been situated in the Mughal north. But it's also really centering the image and looking somewhat more art historically at the evolution and the relationship between images, between representation, rather than the text as the primary material. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that perhaps somewhat differently from how we're used to seeing these things approached art historically, um, the sort of defining question for me here was one of botanical verisimilitude or botanical representation, as is in the title of the talk. What that means is that I make a distinction, and I will explain this a bit further in a moment, between representation that encodes actual botanical information, the kind of depictions that I, as a gardener, get excited about because they actually tell me something about plants, as opposed to vegetal or floral ornament that is sort of divorced from botanical reality. And it's the import of that distinction and the dynamics of that botanic specificity that's really what I'm trying to trace here. So with that, I want to dive in by beginning with the question of botanical regional identity. So the Deccan, from a, again, coming from a sort of Mughal perspective, and this is this first textual source here that I'm beginning with is a Mughal source, is perceived in some realms as a, as a distinct regional entity and as a distinct regional identity. And that for me sort of raises the question, does that correspond to a specific botanical identity? And that seems like a very sort of silly question, because in the real world, obviously, different areas, different geographic regions are distinguished by a distinct plant palette because of climate, because of soil, because of what the agriculture and horticulture in the area, what people grow. The flora of a region is often one of the most distinctive things about it. However, coming from studying South Asian texts about plants, so the traditions of gardening manuals and garden descriptions in Sanskrit and Persian, as well as vernaculars like Dakkani Urdu and Braj and Awadhi that I have been studying for several years now, and that are sort of the backbone of my dissertation research. That becomes a much more broad question, because in these texts, their regional botanical identity is often negated, not explicitly, but implicitly by the sort of repetition of a particular canon of plants dictated as much by literary tradition and cultural import of particular plants as by the actual realities of what could or could not be grown in a particular area. So it's striking when you see textual attempts at establishing some sort of association between particular plants and regional identity. So this passage here, for example, comes from the Miratul Istila, a Persian lexicon of poetic usage, but it's really sort of a more of a general encyclopedia of interesting information by the Delhi-based courtier and Persian scholar and poet Anandaram Mukhlis. It was written in 1745, and in it he has an anecdote under his entry for the betel nut palm, which he calls Supari, talking about the poet Mullah Jamali, which he identifies as Dakkani, even though if it is the Mullah Jamali that I think it is, he spent his life at the Lodi court in Delhi, going to Afghanistan to meet Jami, the Persian poet Jami. And Jami asks him, that since supposedly there are no cypress trees in India, which are commonly used in Persian poetry and later in Urdu poetry as well, to symbolize the perfect, tall, elegant figure of the beloved, what do Indian poets compare the beloved to? And Mullah Jamali says with the betel nut palm, because it's also tall and slender, elegant. And then Jami asks him to recite a verse that illustrates this. He does, as we see here. His stature is a betel palm, my life and soul lie at his feet. And there are puns in there in the original Persian that unfortunately don't really come out in translation. And then Mukhlis specifies, which I think is Mukhlis's particular interest actually in botanical specificity comes out there, because I don't think that the anecdote necessarily was primarily about that, but Mukhlis makes it about it. That the point of this anecdote is that the betel nut palm is exceedingly beautiful, of tall and slender stature, pleasing and delicate, and poor Mukhlis, i.e. he, the author, has observed it a lot in the Deccan. So he associates the betel nut palm with the Deccan as a cultural and botanical marker of the Deccan. And we see here, this is a 18th century painting from Hyderabad, where we see among mango trees and coconut palms, we see very beautifully, if stylized, very beautifully rendered betel nut palms. Mukhlis has a similar anecdote about the 4 o'clock, which is a flower, grown in, knee to waist high. It blooms at night. The flowers can have multiple colors in one flower, about which he writes that in India, its blooms open at night. That's actually, it's true everywhere. And the peak of its flowering is during the monsoon. And within India, again, it grows best of all in the Deccan. So again, he associates a flower with a particular region. Now, this all seems to point to an attempt to associate geography with particular plants, but there are all sorts of issues with that. For one thing, the Jami anecdote is sort of built on a false premise. Cypresses did and do grow in India, and were, because of their import in Persian literature and Persianate literatures like Urdu, were widely and are widely planted in the subcontinent, including in the Deccan. The poetic replacement of cypresses with betel nut palms never seems to have actually become terribly popular. There are instances of it, but the cypresses are still all over Persian poetry and later Urdu poetry throughout South Asia. And the literary canons more generally are actually quite conservative. And that's true both in Sanskrit and sort of more Indic poetic registers and in Persian, in that they have particular plants that they like to mention, that they see as being particularly noteworthy. And those plants tend to get used whether for symbolism or in the description of gardens and so on, whether it's likely that they were actually grown there or not. Now, the 4 o'clock is a particularly interesting intrusion in that, because it's actually native to Mexico. So there is a very real possibility that it was first common in the Deccan, that it first became popular in the Deccan, because it probably arrived through the Portuguese ports on the coast, and so probably reached the Deccan before it really became common in the north. And here we have a mid-17th century Deccani depiction of a 4 o'clock. Then, a photo of the plant for comparison. However, we have a equally realistic, equally well-observed rendering from it that is supposedly from Delhi, from around the same time, maybe marginally later. Which, if it is indeed from the north, there are some things about it that make me wonder if it might actually be Deccani as well. That, these plants weren't actually, they were not unknown or probably even uncommon in the north by this point. So all of this is in a sense meant as a sort of preface to really complicate this idea of associating particular floras in representation in text or image with region, because that turns out to be a very complicated issue. Now, when we turn to Deccani art, specifically, especially Deccani painting, the focus has often been on styles and where what I would call botanical representation, what I would or painting of flowers and plants, is sort of lost at for the sake of floral fantasies. So we have this very famous Bijapur painting, for example, of a yogini in a landscape at the Chester Beatty, that is very, very striking and seen and often poses very typically Bijapuri. And while some of the plants are clearly based on a lotus over here, none of the plants are what I would consider botanic representations. They're all floral motifs, vegetal motifs that are sort of fantasy creations. And then, we have famous renderings of things that are quite literally fantasies, like the tree bearing human women on the island of Wak from sort of Arabic literary tradition in this painting from Golconda, and there are other Deccani illustrations of it. There are a lot of these. These are not what I'm interested in. They are sort of a separate thing for me. And what I really want to focus on is this other mode of representation, which with regard to the Deccan, I think has sort of been ignored a little bit because it's, as we will see, it's seen as a sort of quintessentially Mughal thing at some point, which is a sort of botanically identifiable, realistic representation of plants, and often with the plant as a main focus of the artwork. And in things like this flower study or the study of a 4 o'clock we just saw. So here, these plants actually, this is a Patience balsamina, a balsam, as in the title. We had the betel nut palm. Now this is the balsam of the title. And unlike the 4 o'clock, this is a plant indigenous to the subcontinent, but it does, from my research so far, it does appear in clearly identifiable depictions, at least for the early modern period in the Deccan, before it does in the north. And it's a common sort of very fast growing garden flower. And what I sort of wanted to illustrate here is that there is sort of a botanically realistic yet very stylized mode that emerges in the Deccan that is clearly identifiable as Deccani, even though it seems to sort of represent a convergence, which what is seen as the sort of naturalism of botanical painting under the Mughals in the north. And obviously, these two can't necessarily be separated, because even before the last of the Deccan Sultanates fall to Mughal rule at the end of the 17th century, there is, as we will see throughout this presentation, there is movement of people and ideas and objects and artists throughout the region. There's clear sort of mutual influence and mutual response. So it's not necessarily that this stays separate from conventions of representing plants elsewhere in the subcontinent, but there does seem to be a distinct idiom of rendering botanically specific detailed plants that emerges in the Deccan, which stays somewhat distinct, and I think, and actually it has, as we will see, influences other parts of the subcontinent later on. And just in formal terms, what it's really characterized by is great botanic detail, which somewhat paradoxically is married to a considerable amount of stylization in terms of symmetry or repetition of elements, often outlining, in dark outlining of the shapes of plant parts, and these sort of brilliant jewel tones, and the sort of manipulation of proportions, and as we see here with the sort of tiny miniature flowers relative to the completely oversized main flower, as well as a sort of fantasy landscape setting for things like flower studies, which are usually on plain ground in the north. So just to sort of illustrate this again, how this sort of see here, we have a in a sense, Deccani Mughal, since it's produced in Aurangabad, which is part of what's already the Mughal Deccan in 1669, illustration of a chrysanthemum from a Sanskrit manuscript, of the Siddhantasara philosophical text, in comparison with a Avadi, so sort of late Mughal successor state study of a chrysanthemum, produced a century later, and then from around the same time, a very realistic watercolor of a chrysanthemum. Again, always the same sort of small white flowered variety, which seems to have been dominant in pre-colonial South Asia, from Garhwal, from the sort of foothills of the Himalayas. And we'll see this again. What's sort of striking here, you see this much greater stylization, the outlining, the gold and brilliant jewel tones in the Deccani version. But then you also see that the Deccani version and the Avadi version actually share this somewhat unnatural habit and arrangement of the flowers and buds compared to the very realistic sort of chrysanthemums are very stiff plants, much more stiff, realistic arrangement in the Garhwal illustration, that might well speak to a closer relationship between these two, and this will come up again. And people like Keelan Overton and Deborah Hutton have pointed to the potential relationship, or in some cases, an established relationship between Deccani painting and Avadi painting, but not necessarily for botanical illustration. So just to return briefly to the Mughals as a point of comparison, for the Mughals, floral painting has been studied somewhat more extensively because it's so prominent in many ways in Mughal ornament. And one of the main sort of things that has been studied and highlighted with that regard is the extent to which Mughal artists drew on European florilegia, so European print books of flowers, for their floral motifs, including often of flowers that they wouldn't have seen in real life in India. So we have a page that Ustad Mansoor, who is known as a famous flower and animal painter, although we only have 2 of his flower studies, this and then a more from observation one, which we'll see on the next slide, that sort of highlight how how he took this Dutch floral printer, Netherlandish floral print, and copied it and sort of filled it with colors based on what looked nice, because he didn't actually know what the flowers were. For the most part, he clearly knew what a pink rose was, but the lilies he would not have seen in real life. Now, this is the other surviving flower painting we have by Ustad Mansoor, which is clearly based on observation. It's a Tulipa lanata, a tulip species that grows in Kashmir and what is now northern Pakistan. Very famous. Again, sort of, it's been argued that it copies European conventions of flower painting with the inclusion of the insects and the arrangement, but it's very naturalistic and very clearly based on a observed specimen that you would have found in the sort of Northwest Indian Himalayas. So clearly there are parallels here, probably a relationship between these sort of flower studies and what we see in the Deccan, but the idiom still remains distinct. Now, I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the antecedents to this potential difference in idiom in the Deccan. So we have a very robust tradition in the Deccan based on the manuscript record of these Perso-Arabic, Yunani, ultimately Greek medicine pharmacopoeias and De Materia Medica of Dioscorides translations, both in Persian and Arabic, which have a very distinct manner of botanical illustration, which we'll see here. So this is actually a Dakkani, probably Bijapur example. Here is one from the 11th century from Samarkand. Here is one from Iran from the 13th century. Here's one from Iran from the beginning of the 17th. And these illustrations are they're very schematic. They oftentimes are unidentifiable if you don't have the accompanying text, essentially, if you can't read the accompanying text. They're sort of visual mnemonics. If you know the plant, if you can read the text and you actually know what the plant looks like in real life, then they highlight the salient characteristics of it for you, and sometimes just the salient characteristics for their medical use. But outside of that, they're not botanical illustrations. So they're heavily stylized. They're also surprisingly very, very consistent over this huge period of time and geography. Not in that they always look exactly the same, but in that the sort of idiom, the style, the conventions stay very, very similar. We have numerous examples of this from the Deccan, seemingly very few to none from the north, even though the tradition would have almost certainly been known. They don't seem to have been produced in the north. With the example of this, and this is like the previous page, this too is a hazelnut, supposed to be a hazelnut tree, which was produced probably in Bengal in the 1790s for a European official who commissioned a number of local sort of works on agriculture and related things. Just case in point, the hazelnut trees on this page and the previous page, are basically just a tree with green leaves and little nuts on them. So it could be completely nondescript without the accompanying text. They're also very likely based on an original inspiration that was based on what is known as the Turkish hazel, which isn't usually used for food purposes, but which has this single tall trunk, as opposed to the more common cultivated hazelnut, which is a multi-stemmed sort of suckering shrub. So there's a good chance here that at some point someone created a prototype that lived in an area, Eastern Turkey, northeastern Iran, Caucasus, northwestern Iran, Caucasus, somewhere around there, where the Turkish hazel would have been more familiar, and that then became reproduced. Another potential source or connection of earlier sort of botanical imagery that I just wanted to briefly highlight, also because it connects us to the previous wonderful lecture in the series by Professor Kaligotla, is in medieval temple sculpture, where we do actually have depictions, especially of flowering trees and fruiting trees. So here we have on the left from Badami, what is probably an Ashoka tree in bloom, and on the right, a fruiting mango tree from the Virupaksha temple in Patadakal. Not directly related, perhaps, but still intriguing in terms of how things come to be stylized in the later idiom. So what we just saw there, for example, just as is the mango, and just to sort of give you an idea of the somewhat shifting, but I think still distinct manner of botanical representation. We have the mango tree with these sort of very even clusters of fruit emerging very clearly from the tips of the branches, with the whirl of leaves around them, which is very true, is a very accurate analysis of the habit of how the plant grows. But then it gets repeated in this perfect arrangement, which is, sort of makes it into a somewhat stylized pattern. And we see this throughout a lot of, or most of the Deccani representations of mango trees, whereas in Mughal and later Awadhi and Murshidabad and whatnot, depictions of mango trees in the north, we often, that how the leaves and the fruit relate is oftentimes not worked out nearly as clearly. Also, the fruit is usually of uniform color, whereas in the Deccan, we predominantly, again, with this love for jewel tones, we see these multicolored clusters of mangoes, which of course might also just speak to the predominance of particular varieties in the Deccan that, that shift as they ripen between greens and yellows and oranges, as opposed to predominantly all green or all yellow varieties in other parts of the subcontinent. So here's just more examples across sort of the 17th and 18th century of these sort of depictions of mango trees in Deccani painting. Similar, returning to the betel nut palm, we have a similar sort of, consistent rendering. So here we have a, Golconda painting of a dancing girl. We have the betel nut palm on the left here, very clearly rendered next to what is presumably supposed to be a coconut palm, but is so stylized as to be essentially meaningless. But then on the right, we have very intriguingly, a very naturalistically rendered star gooseberry. Nothing to do with the real gooseberry. It's a relative of the amla tree, which is also called Indian gooseberry, with very acidic, very high vitamin C fruits. In North India, the quote unquote, the amla, the Indian gooseberry, predominates. In many parts of the Deccan, we get this species, Phlantus acidus, the star gooseberry, much more frequently. And you see this sort of repetition of its representation in painting, again, very sort of identifiably rendered. We have the detail from the dancing girl painting on the left here. And this on the right is actually from a century earlier, from the sort of most elaborate, most ornate known manuscript of the Kitab-e-Noras of Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah of II of Bijapur. This folio being at the Cleveland Museum of Art, other folios are at the National Museum in Delhi, where again on the right, while most of the other plants are what I would consider, again, these floral fantasies, on the right we have the star gooseberry, the Phlantus acidus, clearly rendered. Interesting enough, again, mirroring what seem to be palm trees on the other side in this arrangement, very similar to the Golconda painting a century later. And this is just to show you what the plant actually looks like, and to show you how the clusters of fruit and the very particular foliage and arrangement of that foliage, how closely those are actually rendered in these depictions. Now, the Kitab-e-Noras sort of makes a nice transition to more specifically to Bijapur art, and because it is from Bijapur and the sort of heyday of Bijapur as a creative center, and it has these very particular vase designs which reappear in a number of other contexts, including in the wall paintings of the Asar Mahal in Bijapur, where very particular flowers emerge from these sort of ornate fantasy vases. So here on the right, we have a niche where a stylized but very clearly identifiable red hibiscus, a Hibiscus rosa sinensis, so it's more, also used to be called a shoe flower, emerges from this vase in a niche, Um, and then, this is the sort of room as a whole that this is part of. The other niches have similarly stylized oleander emerging from such vases. And in between are pigeon pea vines, which according to Zabrowski, actually are a later addition. They apparently date to the 19th century, which are in a sort of much more realistic idiom. You can see them there compared to the real plant in my garden last summer. But really, and sort of raise the question of whether this is a continuation and further development of a local sort of botanical idiom, or whether they're just a completely new intervention. Because for all their stylization, the original floral designs in the talks, in the niches, are, encode a wealth of accurate botanical information. They're very clearly and immediately identifiable if you know the plants that they're based on. Along a similar line, continuing with this sort of vase motif, here we have a decoupage page, again from Bijapur, with a number of garden flowers. We've got a marigold here, then a rose, and a corn poppy, and then some white irises down here. And again, these are just sort of the real photographed flowers for comparison. Again, rendered in this not exactly realistic, but nonetheless very, very detailed and very, very distinctive idiom. And with that, I just wanted to come back briefly to this painting and to sort of enumerate exactly how many flowers are clearly identifiable. And if we have the 4 o'clock, which is the main player, but then we also have, again, a balsam, very similar to the one we previously saw, a Joseph's coat amaranth, poppies, larkspur, a marigold, another New World introduction that would have been fairly new at this point, would have been around for maybe half a century to a century at this point, but it's one of the first to arrive from Mexico, a coxcomb, a tulip, which presumably would have been borrowed from another artwork since it wouldn't have grown locally in the Deccan, and some sort of mallow, this one being the only one that's not very precisely identifiable. And continuing on sort of with this particularly Bijapuri iteration of these flower depictions, I wanted to turn to this Ragamala from late 18th century Bijapur, so post-Mughal, already Nizami Bijapur, that contains an incredible wealth. So these are from separate, we have one folio here on the left, which is the wealth of botanicals, and then on the right, just a small fraction of the identifiable species on other folios of the manuscript. So you have tuberoses, grapevines, and again, this hibiscus, a plumeria, pomegranates, narcissi, roses, again, the 4 o'clock, a custard or sugar apple, which also was a new introduction from Mexico, like so many of the flowers, the tuberose as well, which are all minutely rendered, and they're not naturalistic in the sense that we see that is sort of celebrated for Mughal art, but they're all perfect representations of the botanical specifics of these plants. And they show a clear continuity, I believe, to what we saw almost 2 centuries earlier in the Asar Mahal imagery. And again, just another example here, we have another Ragamala from another Ragamala series, of flower bed with roses, tuberose, iris, marigold. Now, to wrap up, I just wanted to highlight 2 sort of case studies particular plants that I think speak a little bit to the way some of this imagery might have moved. And this is I think what really bears further investigation if possible. So one of these is the champaka, which is a type of magnolia, not a plumeria, not a frangipani, although in a lot of Indian languages today, the name champa has been extended to that, again, New World Mexican species. So the original champa is a type of magnolia that is native to the subcontinent, but loves sort of moist tropical conditions. So it's actually challenging to grow in many areas. It's, however, standard part of the sort of floral inventory. It's one of the flowers that the Sanskrit tradition really celebrates. Because of that, it gets picked up in Indian Persian really early. Amir Khusro already writes about it in the Nusipir, sort of celebrating India's wealth of beautiful things. However, it rarely appears in imagery in the north until very late. It does appear very ubiquitously in Deccani art, from my findings, at least in the early modern period. So here we have whole champaka trees, again from that Bijapur Ragamala. This is a painting of Abul Hasan Qutb Shah, the last Qutb Shahi ruler of Golconda, holding and smelling a champaka flower. And then here we have Muhammad Adil Shah of Bijapur, again holding a champaka flower and one of those red-orange mangoes. And this is, in a sense, to me, this is telling, because this holding a flower motif for rulers we see in the north as well. We also see it with the Safavids and the Ottomans. But in the north, it's almost always a pink damask rose or a narcissus, whereas in the Deccan, the single most common flower for it seems to be a champa. And similarly suggestive here, I have a poem by Abu Talib Kalim Kashani about the champa, or champaka, which he wrote in describing a garden in Agra for Shah Jahan. After he from 1632 onwards, he's the poet laureate, the Malik al-Shuara of the Mughal court, and he's originally from Iran, but he does start his Indian career in the Deccan. He's originally works at the Bijapur court, and as far as I know, he's the first Persian poet working in the sort of Mughal context to hone in on the champa in this manner. And it does sort of raise the question of whether its prominence for him was sort of part of his Deccani cultural experience, along with the sort of imagery. And along similar lines, we have a sort of progression of this hibiscus imagery, this very particular hibiscus imagery. So we had the Asa Mahal one. Then we have in the late Shah Jahan album, a similar sort of hibiscus, which is the first Mughal one that I've come across chronologically appear in the margins. Then again, we have that Bijapur Ragamala. And then we have this red hibiscus from Awadh from the late 18th century that's been attributed to Mir Chand. And likely, perhaps, if not by Mir Chand himself, at least the atelier, the workshop of Paul Ye, was a sort of Swiss-French courtier in Awadh. And we know, thanks to the work of Keelan Overton, for instance, that workshop collected and reproduced and copied Awadhi and specifically Bijapuri painting. And my friend Bronwyn Gulkis, who I think is attending the talk, has a lot more, I'm sure, to say about this and knows this much better than me. But it sort of raises the distinct possibility that you have this particular hibiscus motif also traveling as a Deccani, as a sort of Deccani import to the late Mughal Awadhi context. specifically because you have these very distinctive features that go all the way back to the Asa Meher version of the very minute relative to what it is like in real life foliage, the buds at various stages, the lack of any representation of the style and the pistil of the flower, which in most hibiscus varieties is very prominent. Instead, the sort of abundance of petals, and we see that across all four depictions, and the very sort of effusive rendering of these little leaf projections at the nodes and around the buds that are sort of a distinctive feature of this type of hibiscus, but are sort of very, very minuscule. They're really prominent in these renderings. Plus, of course, in the floral study, again, the sort of this, unnatural proportions, the single stem emerging as if it were a tree from a fantasy landscape, the rich gold background, which we saw in other Deccan floral studies. Tellingly, the hibiscus or gurhal is also another flower that that Kalim writes about in that same garden description where he talks about the champa. And other than that, he talks primarily about flowers from the Persian canon. So I wanted to end just briefly on the painting that you saw an excerpt of on the email that went out about this talk, which is from the very end of the 18th century, from Hyderabad, probably by Venkatechalam. It's a courtly scene where we sort of see in the back the sort of beautiful rendering of these stylized yet very precise botanicals. We have a false ashoka, a jackfruit, the betel palms, cypresses, coconut palms, banana, and the plumeria, which again is sort of a relatively new and rarely depicted American introduction at this time. And we really also see here the sort of, again, emerging of more of the Indic corpus of plants usually mentioned literary. The jackfruit, for example, is part of virtually every garden description we get in the Sanskritic texts and in Indian vernaculars, but very rarely gets depicted in other parts of the region until I think we really start sort of seeing the influence of Dakkani painting elsewhere. So I'm going to stop there. I know I've gone on for quite a while. I'm very excited for questions and to maybe flesh some of these things out more in response to what interests you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. That was absolutely wonderful. You took us into a garden. If you want to stop sharing your screen, and we can. Okay, so I'm going to give our audience a bit of a chance to think about your presentation and ask questions. We already have one question, but before I open it up, I just want to ask a small question about how quickly foreign imported plant species get illustrated in these in painting or in other media once they arrive. So you had referred to a lot of these imports from Mexico, and I was wondering the rate at which those from the time that they arrive in the Deccan or in South Asia more generally, to the point that they are incorporated in other media, be it painting, textiles, other sorts of media. So I'm curious about this relationship.
So that is an excellent question, and it's something that I've tried to really get a handle on for years now. And what seems to be the case is that and again, this is where I think the interplay of image and text and convention plays such a big role, because it varies dramatically from plant to plant. So the most extreme example of adoption across media that that I have found is the marigold, which can't have arrived much earlier than the second half. It can't really have arrived earlier than the second half of the 16th century. And by the first or second decade of the 17th century, it is everywhere. It is in all the texts about gardens. It is not the technical texts, not the gardening manuals, but in the sort of poetic and literary descriptions of gardens. And it's in painting, both in the Mughal context and seemingly in the Deccan. It also shows up on fabrics in Iran. So basically wherever the marigold goes, it seems to get incorporated remarkably quickly. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like the plumeria, which probably didn't arrive terribly much later, and certainly also relatively quickly seem to have probably enjoyed success in the real world, but very, very slowly and only entered the pictorial record. So the earliest plumeria depictions that I can really point to are these 18th century ones, sort of middle to late 18th century ones in the Deccan. And then similarly from about the same time period, maybe a tad bit earlier, but also less sort of botanically precise, in Bundi in Rajasthan. Nowhere else have I so far found any trace of depictions of plumerias prior to the colonial period. So it sort of really runs the gamut, interestingly enough. But the overall pattern that I think I'm starting to see is that visually, in terms of visual depiction, the Deccan seems to have been slightly more open to the new. But then it also obviously received some of these plants first.
I mean, another question that occurs to me while you were talking is whether or not the botanical evidence, it's these, thinking in terms of Mughal and Deccan, the divide between the two, the botanical evidence actually cuts across these
Exactly.
media, and actually sort of pokes holes in that kind of historiography that I think the field is hopefully starting to move away from in some ways. This example that you gave of Polier is fantastic, and I think that I think that it's an extremely rich one. Can you talk a little bit more about this Deccan Mughal divide, or whether there's anything specific, or whether there's
yes. So again, this is sort of very much still initial for me, and there are a few things that I think I would like to say. But one is that in my previous research, I did work with Deccani materials, but there's a reason I generally didn't engage with the Deccan with sort of Deccani materials as distinct until I looked at painting more extensively, where style or idiom is distinct, is the fact that textually there doesn't seem to be a clear distinction, in the sense that if you look at gardening literature and garden descriptions, there's Ali Akbar Hussein's work that sort of established that you have these elaborate and very detailed, very botanically detailed descriptions of gardens in Deccani Urdu Masnavis. And my work sort of very quickly led to the conclusion that that was actually a larger trend across the subcontinent from the 16th century onward, where across vernaculars and then eventually in Persian as well in the north, you get these ever more elaborate descriptions of gardens for the sake of describing gardens, these ekphrases of gardens, with this great botanical detail. So on the textual level, it is a sort of weird distinction, and with the images, again, it's just very hard to sort of sort out the mutual influence, especially with my focus sort of more on the on the more early modern period. The two are always already interacting at that point, and you have written about Burhanpur as sort of an in-between space, and including for floral imagery that sort of undermines the potential Mughal Dakkani divide. I know Bronwyn also has various points of things she's looking at where, again, in some cases involving florals that sort of undermine that. So yeah, I think there, on the one hand, I think there's this distinct mode, because it does have sort of distinct Dakkani styles that have distinctive features of rendering botanical, quote unquote, realism, of encoding the realness of a plant, and a distinct treatment of when to represent a real plant as opposed to when to just produce vegetal motifs, vegetal ornament. But that develops and emerges and develops, I think, already in conversation with representational modes elsewhere in the subcontinent. And also, what I really didn't touch upon here, because of sort of just made the scope even more unwieldy, is Rajput painting in what is now Rajasthan and adjacent areas, as part of this, because there are all sorts of very clear, I think, links back and forth between Rajasthan and the Deccan, and with regard to floral depictions. The museum note, for example, for that Bijapur Ragamala, that is such a wealth of botanical information, attributes its sort of wealth of flower paintings to the migration of Rajasthani painters to Bijapur, sort of post-Mughal. And I think that link is there, but I wonder whether that's actually the direction of it, and to what degree it wasn't actually Dakkani modes that influenced a lot of developments in the depiction of flowers in parts of Rajasthan.
So the chat is getting very active, and we have a lot of enthusiasm for your talk, which is obvious. But there are lots of detailed oriented questions, and I do want to sort of bracket those off for a moment. I know that you love engaging with those as well, but I do want to ask two questions that I think are kind of are very important. One comes from Beatrice Campi, who asks whether or not towards the later part of the early modern period, with the advent of what is sometimes called company painting, whether or not there is a shift towards more detail in botanical illustration because of those. And then another question comes from Charlotte Giles. Hi, Charlotte. Is about whether or not there's it's a very general question, whether or not there's a difference between illustration on across media. So whether or not when it appears on clothing, and I think we also have Sylvia Hotelling on this call, so I'm sure she could talk a lot about textiles and clothing, but whether or not you're seeing anything about the depiction on different media.
Okay, so with regard to company painting, it's sort of an odd thing. I don't really necessarily see a shift to necessarily greater detail, in the sense that there are definitely like squarely Mughal and squarely Dakkani depictions of plants that, and including floral studies or plant studies that encode as much specific detail about the plant as sort of later company paintings do, or at least the sort of most brilliant ones. And including in the Mughal case, the Dakkani case, there usually, there is that stylization. In the Mughal case, there are some that are, I would also say, are sort of, photorealist, as the, to use a inaccurate term, as the sort of later company paintings are. So I don't think there's necessarily a shift. What I do think, though, or at least what I've been wondering about, is the extent to which these different modes or idioms of flower painting between North and South, if not strictly, Deccan and Mughal perhaps, impact the company painting that are produced, company paints that are produced in Bengal versus in the sort of Madras presidency, and in sort of courts that are in that in between space. So, for example, the Tanjavur Saraswati Mahal Library collection of botanical paintings, which were done for a local patron, so they're not company painting per se, but stylistically, and in terms of their sort of European botanical commitments, they are in many ways in line with company painting, but in their sort of ornamental qualities compared to the compared to the Bengal ones, they seem much more Dakkani to they're much more sort of playful and curvilinear and sort of highly outlined than than the work of Sheikh Zainuddin and Bhavanidas and whatnot in Bengal. So I think because of the artist's training and what they've been exposed to, there's probably an influence there. With regard to fabrics, I purposefully sidestepped fabrics here because I do not really feel ready to delve into them fully. I think there is definitely somewhat of a shift because in botanical specificity, in the sense that fabric almost, I think, the textiles demand a greater stylization, which lends itself, on the other hand, to the sort of Dakkani idiom. So, those archetypal poppies that we see all over the place, work really well in that sort of slight abstraction. So yeah, it looks different when it's on textiles, but I can't necessarily and its botanical identifiability because of that becomes rarer. So we don't, there's lots and lots of poppies. We don't see a terrible amount of like more uncommon flowers and whatnot in fabric from my sort of, far from exhaustive perusal. But on the other hand, there are certainly instances. So, for example, I've seen a toddy palm on a Palampur sheet that is clearly botanically identifiable and very much in this Dakkani mode. So there is crossover, I would venture.
I'm going to read one last question, but everyone who has asked a question, we will stay on after we formally end the lecture to answer some of the more detailed oriented questions. But Alice West asks whether or not there's a dictionary of Deccani plants, I wish they were, illustrated with the art of the period. And she encourages you to make one. And she will ask you another question.
Thanks, Alice.
At some point. I also wanted to note that we are aware that there has been some confusion about the timing of these lectures because of the shift in daylight savings. But Nicolas has kindly agreed to put this lecture online. So please join me in thanking Nicolas for a wonderful lecture today. I will just say that our next lecture is on April 30th with Julia A.B. Hegevald, who will be speaking on Jaina temple architecture of coastal Karnataka, climatic dependencies and artistic freedoms. And Helen, would you like to just close our session for us today and with any questions or comments? Can't hear you. Helen, we can't hear you.
Now?
Yes, now we can hear you. There you go.
Well, I wanted to say that it was a most enjoyable lecture, very interesting. I love flowers and I love plants. And it was really a pleasure. And the miniatures you chose were absolutely wonderful. I wanted to ask you, on some of the stucco work, with which I work a lot, in the period that precedes whatever you talked about, you have a lot of flowers that go back to local traditions, much more than flowers that you would expect to find, let's say, in an Islamic garden. And what you also find, it's not a flower, it's a fruit in funerary monuments. And that relates more to Vivek's question regarding the time span between the arrival of a plant and its presentation, its representation, is the pineapple. You find pineapples on 3 monuments, all of which date from the middle of the 16th century. And obviously, the pineapple arrived with the Portuguese. And it was, I've never seen it anywhere else but in funerary monuments. And I have also wondered why is it in funerary, in late 16th and 17th century, that's when they appear. We have it in a monument in Gulbarga. We have it in Afzalpur. We have it, which is near Bijapur. Then we have it in Golconda. And at the tomb of Abdallah in the Qutub Shahi tombs. So
What's going on?
What happened? Okay.
We have to kick this person off, whoever this is.
Okay. Okay. So we are left.
We don't know what's happening here, but
someone is sharing their screen. Yes. That shouldn't be.
I know. Someone who is not a part of our.
Yeah. So
Neil, can we kick this person off?
I think that the time.
Oh, it's over. It's over. There we go. Yeah.
There you go.
Helen.
Yes. No, I thought that this time, the difference in time between, I think that the pineapple arrived in India at about the turn of the century, I mean, in around the early 16th century. And then it starts to be represented about 40 years later, 50 years later, for specific things only. And I was wondering whether we know anything about it, because...
So the pineapple is interesting, has been interesting to me from working from Mughal sources, because the pineapple is one of the very few of the new quote unquote American plants whose arrival and foreign origin is acknowledged in the sources. So the marigold, for example, just appears and is treated as a regular flower, as a ubiquitous flower, without any sort of, like, there's nothing about it arriving, nothing of it being ever not being there, etc. Whereas with the pineapple, the Aina Akbari reports that it was first in the Firangi ports, and since then has sort of become more common across North India, and also that you can easily, Abul Fazl also reports that you can easily transport it in a container and replant it, which speaks to the sort of mobility of it, because it's not a big, probably because it's not a big tree and because it has a short life cycle. And so there is a memory there of it being foreign, and that gets reproduced, all the way through to the 18th century. So Mukhlis, still cites Abul Fazl to say, that it used to not be common, and then it is common. Jahangir also comments on it, and so on. And Mukhlis also comments on the fact that if you are in an area where they're not widely grown, then that they're suitable for formal gift giving. So he says that, like, a couple of decades ago, they were still not, while they were known, they were still not very readily available in Delhi. So a pineapple made a good gift in Delhi. But then they started being grown in large numbers in Ghaziabad. and sort of became easily accessible in Delhi, so now they're not a good gift anymore. In visual representations, they're relatively rare in the Mughal context as well. I have yet to see an architectural representation of them.
I can send you. I can show you.
In the Mughal context.
No, my context is pre-Mughal, and you have representations.
But the few album depictions that do exist are in the Mughal context are sort of concurrent to this. So they're also, they're beginning and middle of the 17th century. So there's a painting of Jahangir with a tray that includes a pineapple in front of him. And then there is a Shah Jahan era painting of a posthumous Shah Jahan era painting of Akbar with a whole pineapple plant at his feet.
But why is it on funerary monuments only?
We don't know.
I don't know, and it's clearly distinct from the Mughal use of them.
Symbolic connotation, which we don't know. Anyway, thank you so much. It was really, really wonderful, and we hope to see you again in some other in our next webinars. And Vivek already mentioned that our next webinar will be Julia Hegewald, who also is going to present us the new guidebook that the Deccan Heritage has published on the giant monuments of the Deccan. So thank you so much for this most enjoyable lecture. Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you, Nicolas. So this is the formal end of our session.